Well, Happy New Year, property PR professionals. Welcome everyone to this special Property for Media Meets webinar. It's early January, so of course it must be Property Editors 2026 predictions. I'm Henry Hemming, advisor to Property for Media. Great to have you here. It's an event that always draws a large crowd and a very particularly pucker crowd. And I think, of course, what brings you here is the lineup of talent we have with us today, here to predict story upon story, appropriately for property, is a trio of property editors whose readerships cover off an immense chunk of the UK's property buying public. So let me introduce them now so they can say hi. We have Beatrice Hodgkin, editor of the FT's House&Home. Hello, Beatrice.
Morning. Hi.
Great, great to have you back. We have Carol Lewis, the property editor of the Times and Sunday Times. Hello, Carol.
Hi there.
And last and not least, making a first appearance on the Property for Media Meets webinar, we've got Helen Crane, Deputy Editor, Daily Mail Money, and This Is Money. Helen, thank you so much for joining us.
Hi, everyone.
Lovely. So the way the session will work, I'm sure you all know this in the audience, is that our property editors will deliver a few of their predictions for the year ahead, not just the where and the how much, not just the financial and regulatory, but also how our changing lifestyles will impact the trends we witnessed, something that Beatrice illuminated the debate with last year. Overall, I'm sure we'll cover off predictions about property prices, mortgage rates, mortgage availability, new builds, and very possibly the north-south divide, the tightening divide. So buckle up for that. And our guests will also give property PRs a few helpful pointers on what they and their colleagues will and won't be looking to cover this year, how best to pitch ideas to them. So I hope this is also a great training session on that front, especially to some people in the audience, perhaps a bit new to the property PR world. As ever, we love questions, so do please pose them using the Q&A button, and do put your company name at the end of your question if you'd be so kind, just in case I don't know who you are. Lots of questions, please. Go mad on social and do copy in our panelists on your posts. So let's get going. Property in 2026, and Carol Lewis has kindly volunteered to go first. Carol is the property editor of the Times Sunday Times, took over in the hot seat in 2022, almost 5 years in a row. She's worked in the Times for over 10 years on business, finance and property, was previously in health journalism. Thank you so much, Carol. Can we hear your deep dive on the property year ahead?
I'm not sure about deep dive. The reason I've offered to go first is so I can get the easy pickings and Helen and Beatrice can pick up the rest. On the face of it, the statistics for the property market don't look that remarkable. The average property price growth is likely to be 1 to 4% on average across the country. Obviously, there'll be greater activity and price growth in those more affordable areas. I think we're going to see more activity in the north of England and Scotland than we are in the south and London, for instance. There's been a brief flurry of activity in the prime markets post-budget, and that was because the budget wasn't quite as bad as it could be. I know we had the high value council tax surcharge announced, but on the whole, it wasn't as bad as it could have been. It could have been, there were rumours of CGT on main homes. I mean, that would have been devastating. So although it's not great, it's not as bad as it could. So there's been a little pent-up demand come. And with prices at the super prime end down 20% off the peak, then we will see some bargain hunters out there. But on the whole, I expect things to remain pretty subdued, to be honest. Valuations will start for that higher council tax surcharge this year. It comes in 2028. I think we're going to see the valuations start this year. And we're going to expect to see people appealing, people not happy with where their house is in the rankings. I do think it'll make a great deal of difference just yet, although we are likely to see some bunching around the thresholds in listings. I think that is for sure. You know, you are going to see a little bunching below the 2 million mark, for instance. Interest rates are likely to fall. The base rate probably likely to go to 3.5, which will translate into lower mortgage rates, although that does depend on what inflation does. And we also have to bear in mind that there's a lot of people who have still got to come off 5-year fixes this year, who fixed back when rates were around 2%. So even if they're going to 4%, it's still a shock. They've been lulled into a false sense of security with those lower rates. First-time buyers, I think, will still make up a higher proportion of the market than others, just because cost of living is still biting us all. And I think Bank of Mum and Dad will still be giving out money. But it's still difficult to get a deposit. There's still high rents. And with no replacement for Help to Buy, they're going to be reliant on schemes like Rent to Buy and shared ownership and so on. Landlords, I don't believe there is an exodus. I think, yes, there are those that are selling, and there might be more as we approach the new higher income tax, which comes in next April, doesn't it? I think some more will sell, but we've still got people buying. So the balance remains pretty consistent. I don't think there'll be a massive shift there. Hopefully rents have stopped skyrocketing and they'll ease out. I'm pretty excited actually for the consultation that ended in December on streamlining and speeding up the way we buy and sell homes. And this year, the government's going to announce its timetable for introducing the new changes. Hopefully, we'll be moving to a bit more of a missive style system like the Scottish have, with upfront information and binding offers. And we could see greater adoption of online processes, digital processes, which would be amazing. Far too many sales fall through. It's far too stressful to buy a home in England. Despite this, obviously it's very uncertain times. We've still got Trump, Putin, etc. And who knows what they're going to do in the next year. We cross our fingers and hope Labour have learnt their lesson from the last budget and don't leak everything out for 6 months in the run up to the next budget. But, nothing's certain. Should I say a couple of points about how we're going to work? And
please do, Carol.
I had a couple of things on my mind about how we interact with PRs. The one is that we have more and better data than ever on what people view, read, and engage with on our website. So we can tell very quickly what they like and what they don't like, and we can move very quickly. We know, for instance, that readers do not like to be fed disguised marketing or advertorials. And in fact, they see it where it's not even there. So we've got to be super, super careful. We can't do straight PR about development, sales, products, or brands. We know it doesn't do well and it annoys readers. And we get a lot of adverse comments. So we're changing. So for instance, one thing is we used to do a lot of, and I used to write these myself, we do the new developments in France, south of France, for instance. We do the new developments there, and this is what's on the market, and this is how much it is, and this is how much what you could buy for your money. That's very tailored to people who are investing abroad and buying second homes abroad. We're now much more interested in first-person stories and practicalities, visas, jobs, residency, and so on for people who are moving to the south of France permanently, and particularly young people, because the statistics show younger people are moving. They're not looking for second homes. I mean, those are still there. People still want them, but we're tailoring it quite different in the way we talk about it. We're not doing for sales so much, development so much. It's much more the practical, how can I move abroad post-Brexit at the moment and live elsewhere? The other thing that's on my mind is you'll have all seen the Press Gazette stories about fake PR companies and fake case studies and AI-generated quotes. And we are taking this super, super seriously. I've instructed all journalists who work for me that they cannot file any quote that comes over email, has to be over the phone, has to be in person, and all people quoted need to be verified as real. And FYI, any PR does not have a phone number on their email, cannot be expected to be quoted. I've just got to be super, super careful. So I just wanted to highlight those couple of things.
That's an amazing announcement at the start of the year, and 100% clear why you have to do that. So PRs, be warned. Spokespeople must be available to then, if necessary, kind of give a quote again, but make sure that it's authentic.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, thanks for that, Carol. Interesting, very interesting development. Well, let's. I'm sure we've got questions for Carol already coming in. Just a reminder, questions, please. But let's get to our second panelist, Helen Crane, the deputy editor of This Is Money and Daily Mail Money. So Helen focuses on housing, mortgages, and consumer rights, consumer issues. She was previously property editor at City AM and worked for industry title Property Week. Helen covers property online and in print, for example, in the Money Mail section on Wednesdays and also in Sunday's Wealth and Personal Finance section. Helen, what do you make of the year ahead?
Yeah, so I'll try not to just repeat everything that that Carol said. That was such a good summary. I think the first thing to say is we've already had a few press releases and things at the start of this year saying it's going to be, a booming start to the year. I'm personally not so sure. I think it sounds boring, but I think it's going to be a bit of a steady as she goes sort of year, which maybe isn't a bad thing given the market's obviously had some fairly extreme kind of ups and downs over the last few years. So I think sort of price-wise, activity-wise, I do think it's going to be fairly flat. Obviously, the budget pressure is off. That was sort of dominated the end of last year for us, just constant budget stories, tax stories. Our readers, turns out, are so interested in anything to do with tax. So that's still a big area for us. But obviously, unless you own a 2 million plus house, the budget probably wasn't as bad as you maybe expected. I do think there's still a few factors weighing on the housing market. So unemployment obviously rising, which is probably going to keep things fairly dampened. Mortgage rates, falling, but still 4% plus for most people. And as Carol said, still this year, there's people coming off 5-year fixes who might be going from kind of 1% to 4 point something percent, which is a big sort of concern. I think people are still quite worried about household budgets. So in my opinion, I think that will keep things sort of relatively subdued. I think that will lead to things like people staying in their homes for longer. So we're interested in doing a lot of things on, improve, not move. What are people doing to their houses to make sure that they're still a place that they want to live for kind of the longer term. I do think as well, though, there will be some locations that do still do well this year. We're hearing about Scotland, Northern Ireland, the Northwest. I think in those more affordable markets, there's still some more kind of growth to come. And we're so interested in any data stories, digging into particular locations, not just house prices, but where are happiest places to live, where are good places to retire, and anything. Our readers are so interested in that really sort of granular data down to sort of specific towns and postcodes. We're really interested in all of that stuff. We've got a really good new graphics desk who love making kind of maps and charts, and anything that PRs can offer us on that kind of thing is sort of hugely useful to us. I think it's going to be a big year for first-time buyers, 2026. Obviously, still very tough to get a deposit together. But I think there were some Zoopla stats out recently that said they made up nearly 40% of the market last year. I think that's going to continue. Maybe less competition from movers in the market. Mortgage lenders are offering these sort of slightly bigger mortgages, letting people borrow higher multiples of their salary. So I think first-time buyers that will be sort of keener than ever to get on the ladder. Longer mortgages as well is something that we've been looking a lot at. People stretching to sort of 35, even 40 years. And I think one of the trends we're looking at within that is what's happening to the flat market. So obviously things aren't looking great for flats, particularly in London. I say sitting in my flat in London. But I think there's a real trend towards first-time buyers buying later, maybe skipping straight towards a terrace or a house. They're buying in their 40s, they've maybe got children. A flat in a sort of city centre isn't necessarily what they're looking for. So I think, the suburbs, sort of medium-sized house in the suburbs might be one of the kind of success stories of 2026. Politically, leasehold reform is something that we've been looking at. Obviously, that's kind of trundling on through the courts, and that feeds into this whole story around flats potentially being devalued. I think on the first-time buyer side as well, there was this talk of lifetime ISA reform in the budget. That's something our readers are quite interested in. Obviously, a lot of people kind of rely on that product and are wondering what will happen to that. Rumours of maybe Help to Buy coming back as well, which I think would be a real sort of shot in the arm for the house builders, which have kind of struggled. What else have we got? Yeah, I think another big story will be this sort of generational wealth transfer. So a lot of our readers are really worried now about things like inheritance tax, obviously pensions being kind of dragged into that net. And I think people who are able to will look more at, can we give money to our children, maybe to get them on the housing ladder in the first place. But I think also increasingly older, people with young families looking to upsize are still also now taking money from their families who've got this sort of property wealth and saying, can you help us get to the next step on the ladder? So I think that'll be a big kind of story of this year. Moving abroad as well, a lot of our readers are interested in, they feel that they're being hit by taxes in this country. Can we, can our pension go further somewhere else? And not just the classic sort of France and Spain. We've had readers who are moving to like Greece, Malta, Bulgaria. I think people are sort of casting their net a bit wider in that way. And then finally, landlords, obviously huge changes this year. We've got the Renters' Rights Act coming in May, which will make it more difficult to evict tenants. Changes to the way that you can put in rent rises, which I think, is great news for tenants. And I think it's something that definitely needs to happen. But I think, in my opinion, maybe sort of mum and pop landlords, accidental landlords might fall away. And I think there'll be more sort of professional outfits in the market, people with lots of properties. And I think something that we get pitched a lot is stories about build to rent. And we kind of feel that they're not always quite right for our audience. But I do think it's maybe an opportunity for, if build to rent can make a good, affordable offering at a decent price point, maybe there's an opportunity there. So I think that's it for me, sort of trends wise. In terms of how to pitch to us, as Henry said, I work on This Is Money. We're now at the Mail, we're working together as one sort of big happy family across This Is Money, which is the online money channel, and then the Money Mail print section on a Wednesday, and also the Mail on Sunday wealth and personal finance section. Which means we can be a lot more flexible in terms of how we sort of use stories that are pitched to us. So, something might be pitched to the paper, but we might think it would be better for online with it might lend itself to a graphic or something like that. Or we might be pitched an online story and think, actually, we could develop this and it'd be something that's great for the paper. So I think we're definitely being more flexible. We also, as a lot of you listening probably know, have launched our Mail Plus sort of online subscription model last year. So what we're looking for that is essentially we want that to be stuff that readers can't read elsewhere. So not necessarily an exclusive story. That's great, but an exclusive angle, an expert that hasn't sort of spoken about this topic anywhere else. As I said, any exclusive data, essentially trying to give our readers sort of something extra and something that will be worth paying for, I guess, is what we're looking for with that. I think how to pitch to us, ideally for the paper, a couple of weeks lead is great, so we can make sure we have space for it. We're normally busy on Tuesday and Friday afternoons getting sections together, so that's probably the only time that we wouldn't massively welcome a phone call kind of late in the day on those days. But otherwise, email, phone, happy to be pitched either way. The people who are working on property stories mostly now is myself, Ed Magnus, who's our senior reporter, often covers mortgages and policy kind of stuff. James Entons, who is our freelancer, who picks up a lot of property, kind of more lifestyle-y stuff, sort of renovations, property trends, that kind of thing. And then Lucy Evans, who's a reporter on the paper, does a lot of the sort of data type stories, but pitch to any of us and we'll kind of make sure it gets to the right person. Face-to-face meetings, great if anyone's willing to come to High Street Kensington for a coffee or a lunch. That's always really appreciated. I know it's a huge pain to get on the Circle line, but we love to get out when we still can. Sometimes it's a bit of an ask to sort of travel across London in the middle of the day, but we are still really keen to sort of meet people in person. So yeah, any offers of that, great as well. I think that's about it from me.
Thank you, Helen. That's a brilliant overview. High Street, Ken, a very nice place to head to for a coffee. A
If you can get there.
Yeah. Quick question. How many property stories is the Mail putting out a week across all of its various titles? And also, if I may, what makes a good property story for Mail Plus, the kind of paywalled content?
Yeah, good question. So property stories in terms of numbers, it kind of depends. So there's the Friday property section, which isn't run by the Money Desk. That's a one page, and that tends to be something like property profile or maybe an area profile. That is run by Harriet Syme, who's the sort of travel editor, but that page comes within that section. So on the money sections, we tend to do things, buying and selling your home, property tips, basically anything other than the real sort of lifestyle property profiles and interiors would kind of fall under our remit. We don't have a sort of target for how many property stories we have in this section each week. It's, if it's a good story, it'll go in essentially. I would say we normally have at least kind of one or two across the two paper sections every week on average, but there's no sort of target for how many we have or don't have. I think for Mail Plus, as I said, really anything that has a sort of exclusive angle, so property expert stuff has worked really well. I'm a property expert and this is how much I think house prices are going to go up, or these are what I think the big property trends are going to be of the year. Data stuff has worked really well for that as well. So I think we had something on like the best places to retire to, and we had a map and sort of expert comment and on the different areas. So that works really well. I think anything case study led. I mean, it doesn't have to be just for Mail Plus, but for the paper sections and for online as well. We just find that personal sort of first person property stories are doing so well. People who've downsized, people who've moved to a different part of the country, people who've moved abroad. People who found interesting ways of, helping their children get on the property ladder. I think anything with a personal story just does so well. So yeah, any case study is always welcome.
Okay, well, that's invaluable advice for our audience. Thank you so much, Helen. Okay, and to complete the overviews on this new year in which we find ourselves, we have Beatrice Hodgkin, the editor of the FT's very successful House&Home brand. Beatrice has been in the hot seat since July 2024 and has been with the FT for just over 12 years. Previously as deputy editor of what I used to call How to Spend It, but now HTSI. Bridget is also the author of several books on art and culture. It would be great to have your thoughts on the market this year, Beatrice, and also how property PR professionals can pitch to the FT.
Great. Thank you. So I guess just a kind of reminder for us is that our outlook is definitely global. So when I think about putting together the section every week, it's really important to me that there's a kind of full span of kind of across the globe. I definitely don't just cover the UK. And I think about what we kind of deliver on a weekend in a kind of quite a holistic way. So I very much think about have a global outlook and think about global mobility and who's moving where and why, what they're buying, why they're buying it. Our readers are affluent and international and discerning. And as Carol, to back kind of reiterate what Carol said, they also can absolutely smell a promo and it backfires basically. If it feels like that, then people, and exactly as Carol said, like they sometimes see it when it isn't there. So they're really wary and they're really, they're very sort of. I often say when people are writing opinion pieces, please don't sort of bang on about the company that you founded or you represent. Like your insight and your advice is the thing that's going to sell you. It's going to really sort of sell you as a kind of as a person to be respected in your company as something to be kind of valued. And if you try and push it directly, it's absolutely going to backfire. But anyway, so with that sort of context, I'll put it in context of what we do with the rest of the FT in a minute. But in terms of my predictions, last year, one of our most successful stories was obviously about that other people have talked about, kind of right pricing, and the fact that many people just cannot get it into their heads that their houses have not risen in value as much as they hoped. And if you price your home too much when you list it, the buyers are just going to be very give you a wide berth. And I think that this year, there's just a lot of opportunity for canny buyers, and I think it's kind of going to be the year of the canny buyer, and what they're seeing and the opportunities they're taking advantage of where the others aren't is going to be where the stories are. And I think that if anyone from the kind of PR side knows of people who are taking advantage of those opportunities, then those are the kind of stories we're interested in telling. Similarly, last year we heard a lot about kind of American interest. From my point of view, it felt very much like all the statistics that people were throwing around were very much based upon inquiries and not very much follow through. And so but I do think there's momentum behind that interest. So I'm very interested to know in where the kind of follow through ends up with American buyers, because I think that definitely kind of at the top end of the market, there is interest in, if not moving as your kind of primary residence, than buying a second property just to kind of diversify your portfolio. And one of the most successful stories on the news desk was about Americans buying in Andermatt, and I just think and they are looking across Europe and the globe, and it's just very interesting to me to know where they're actually going to follow through in terms of buying outside of America. We can all understand why Americans will be looking to buy somewhere else. And we did a story about people setting up their sort of plan Bs. And really just, I don't know whether that, it's sort of actually they're intending on moving, but at least to kind of have somewhere else that, is a foothold outside of the US. So I'm intrigued to know like where they're going to be, generating a lot of interest. And following through. As Carol and Helen both talked about, the rental market is of real interest to me. Again, one of my most successful stories last year was talking about the super prime end of the market, how renters, people at the super prime end, they're renting more than buying, because actually when you do the maths in London, it makes more sense to rent. Often makes more sense to rent for sort of 4 years than to buy. And with all the kind of changing nom-dom status and the kind of new 4-year rules, like there's people with their financial advisors suggesting that renting is better than buying. So there's but I think that kind of in a holistic sense, there's potentially a lot of stories across the kind of the breadth of the kind of renting and landlord landscape that we'll be interested in covering. And I think that readers are interested in it. And from both a landlord perspective, should they be selling? To renters, kind of getting a better sense of what the kind of the landscape offers. So I'm definitely interested in those stories, and I think there will be change. I'm also interested in how in AI. I mean, sorry, it's a pretty obvious thing to say, but I'm interested in how it finds it kind of a meaningful groove in the real estate market. Obviously, there's loads of people just going onto ChatGPT and asking questions on there, but I'm interested. I think we will see. I hope that we would see some interesting players coming to the fore who are taking advantage of AI, and I'm interested to know who they might be and what they're doing to kind of, I guess, harness the power in a way that's less the Wild West than we're kind of seeing at the moment. But we're definitely seeing people using ChatGPT to speed up the process. in terms of buying and house valuations and the due diligence that goes on around everything from renovations to buying to selling. And the people who behind the scenes who can take advantage of that, I think will be interesting to kind of see what they have to kind of offer and how. In terms of areas, I'm not quite sure how to cover it, but it is interesting that the places that are opening up to foreign buyers, obviously Saudi Arabia is one in the coming weeks. Personally, I feel quite nervous about how to cover that for obvious reasons. But other areas, I think kind of the Nordics are always really interesting. Just, you know, from it's a story that from the holiday perspective, you know, the Nordics increasingly kind of cooler summers, but you know, their snow is better. So I feel like there's definitely a move that's kind of starting in the travel industry and moving towards property. You know, sometimes the travel industry can be a bit of an indicator of what's happening. You know, what could happen in the property market, and I think that you're definitely seeing more travel there. So I will definitely be keeping an eye on up there. So yes, to reiterate both what Carol and Helen said, personal stories again do really, really well for us. I know I've kind of said it, but sort of people are wary and suspicious, and you know, personal stories always just resonate really well. Also, there's been a bit of a clampdown about anonymous case studies. I can do them. Obviously, I completely understand that, you know, often at the top end of the market, people don't want to reveal their, you know, their identities, and that can be fine within a piece. I definitely cannot open with anonymous case studies. There's been a kind of real crackdown on it at the FT. So yeah, case studies who we can, you know, verify would be preferred. Probably also worth flagging, we've had some regular specials that we added to last year. Roughly they've kind of broken down into kind of seasonal, kind of countryside living, sunshine and waterside living in the summer, or city living in the autumn, and in the winter ski and festive. Last year we added super prime in March, well-being in the summer, and a small golf supplement that did very well with readers. I mean, personally, I can't really face more stories about Dubai, but everyone seems to lap them up. But obviously there's all the other areas in that region that, you know, people who might be interested in Dubai are also interested in moving to. This year we're adding a golf special, sustainability special, both in the spring, renovations in autumn, and an Asia special in the kind of late autumn, winter. Just a little bit of a reminder of how things are broken down. Obviously, many of you will know Nathan Brooker, who moved from being editor of House&Home to editor of Money about 2 years ago. We talk a lot, but you know, the focus there, it's quite separate what we do, and you know, the kind of more mortgages stories that will kind of fall towards him, and we tend to focus on lifestyle stories and human stories, and you know, advice and insight in a very kind of you know, in a very kind of narrative driven way. We obviously have the kind of news desk, the property correspondent is Julie Steinberg. She joined the FT last year, I think from the Wall Street Journal. And then obviously the different reporters in different countries have their beats. And so they will often do property focused stories that relate to the different areas, and then quite often, because we're not really set up to be super news reactive on House&Home. Obviously, to a certain extent, we are, but not quite as much as those original those local reporters or Julie. So what we tend to do is sort of step back and take a look at the kind of, and join the dots between their stories and look at the kind of the whys and what are the impacts and the human or the personal angles and local colour. You know, good example of this might be, for example, when there was a lot of non-dom news whenever it was, about 18 months ago. Obviously, it's real FT territory, and many stories about tax changes and implications and whether people not would move. And so we sort of took a step back, and there were lots of stories, be there about Milan or wherever people were moving, and we took a step back and looked at the all the different places people might consider, and looked at the kind of property landscapes in each of those. We knew that there were kind of tax stories around them, so we fed that in, but it was mainly kind of, what does the housing stock look like? In Milan, we know, for example, that the kind of housing stock for that sort of that sort of house home buyer is not as robust as it might be. So where else might they be looking in the area? That sort of thing. So we just looked kind of globally at joining, as I said, sort of joining the dots between those stories that the news desks were delivering. Again, we take a look at the kind of personal stories and look at it through that kind of the lens of the kind of personal experience, and that's also something that feels kind of more unique to us. A quick kind of recap of our types of features. We have a perspectives kind of opinion slot on page 2, which is always very popular. Readers really like it. It covers absolute gamut of things. It could be, 1 week it was a gardening story about how to make friends with a robin. The next week it's about kind of, insights about property market for, the coming months. So it really kind of goes broad. Again, readers love property insights, but it absolutely cannot be pushing an agenda. They'll just see through it and it will just backfire. So what they want is like genuine insights. They can be provocative. They can be, not something that I agree with. It's not the kind of, it has to kind of dovetail with what we're saying the rest of the section. It needs to be not pushing a story that they want to tell, if you see what I mean. Otherwise, it will just horribly backfire. Always interested in area focuses. We've been doing a bit of a sort of areas pitted against each other. If you're considering moving, the areas that might kind of tempt you, the two areas that might tempt you, the differences between them. At homes, we kind of do at homes with high profile people, but I'm always I'm overwhelmed by creatives, so really interested in kind of business leaders if they have an amazing home, and always interested in interesting renovation stories that tell a fantastic story. Trying to think, that probably covers most of the things I'm looking for. Emails, just please short, concise, and clear. The longer they are, the less likely I am to get to the bottom of them. Don't be afraid to follow up if I don't reply. I cannot reply to everything, and I cannot actually read everything in my inbox, so sometimes it does take a polite nudge. Tuesdays and Thursdays tend to be the best days to get in touch with us. Wednesdays and Fridays just are very tricky, so not those, please. As Helen said, yes, I'm very happy to go for coffees. Probably not lunch, but happy to go for coffee. But it's much better for me if there's a kind of clear there's clear stories being pitched or data being discussed. Like general chats are quite frustrating. And yes, original exclusive data always, and unique personal stories always the things that will kind of grab our attention. I think that's probably it. Terrific,
Beatrice. Thank you so much. Wonderful. I'm going to come straight back to you with a question that we've received from Lloyd Hughes, comms director at Athena Advisors. They're an overseas property brand. So obviously that market has had various headwinds affecting it in recent years, but he is saying, are there any areas of major interest for you in terms of overseas markets at the moment, and is it buyer stories that he needs to produce to pique your interest? And finally, what if the buyer does want to remain confidential? What are your thoughts, Beatrice, on the European market?
I mean, I think if buyers want to remain, I do understand if buyers want to remain confident, like anonymous. It makes things tricky, and I couldn't hang a story off them. But that doesn't mean that their story isn't of interest. So probably it's just, I wonder if there's a kind of, if there's something particularly interesting about their story, it's probably worth just us discussing it, because that could springboard into something broader, and then we could see if there are other people who are kind of experiencing the same thing. Sorry, it's difficult to talk in without having a specific example. In terms of areas, I mean, I've got a very wide areas that I look at, like I'm sort of nowhere's really off limits particularly.
I mean, he talks about Anglophonic investors, that's English speaking. US interest in Lisbon has doubled down. US interest in the French Alps is doubling. UK interest in ski properties is increasing in the face of climate changes. Are there any kind of in vogue parts of the world that you particularly want to tackle this year?
Well, I mentioned earlier that I'm kind of interested in the Nordics, and yes, trying to get my head around how to cover Saudi Arabia, but definitely the Gulf.
The Gulf,
I would say that yes, all those. Lisbon is a tricky one, and Portugal is a tricky one, mainly because I feel like we could cover it all the time, and actually we've covered it so much. It's just, from my point of view, is there something new to say? Because we have just covered quite regularly how much there is continued interest. I mean, it's been I think it's sort of slightly changing with the changing tax rules in terms of buying residences. So I think it's slightly cooled, but still very much, if there's a new angle, please, let me hear it, because let's discuss it, because I would be there's definitely interest from readers, and so if there's a new perspective, then great.
And Carol, you cover a lot of international property. I know you're an expert in that area, and you said earlier that you're very interested in kind of granular details, tax regimes, that sort of thing. Any geographical areas of focus this year for you and the team?
Well, we've just launched a new series this last week, which is Make Your Move to ... It was Austria this first week. It's going to be Ireland next week. We're going to try and look as many markets as we can. It's not always the obvious. Like I think Helen said, it's, people are moving to Poland, and, it's not all South France and Spain, although we will cover them, and Dubai and elsewhere. I wanted to say with Lloyd's question, I'm interested very much in what Brits are doing, but also interested in what Americans are doing, because we have the American site as well, that we write for. So it is the case that I can write about purely what Americans are doing and push that higher up on the American site than it would be on the British site. In terms of the case studies and Lloyd's question, like Beatrice, I prefer that they gave their full name, but we do, if there is a problem, and I know there sometimes is, we do sometimes just carry their first name or allow them to change their name. They have to tell us their name though. They have to give us their details, but we can do it where we just put, say, Henry asterisk name withheld, that kind of thing. We can, if the story's good enough, we'll get around it.
Terrific. Helen, did you want to add anything to this on either international or confidentiality? And you just,
I guess just quickly, we haven't sort of historically done a huge amount on international property, but I think we have found recently that we've sort of found a good niche of stories about people moving abroad and why they're moving abroad, and maybe, somewhere that you wouldn't necessarily expect. And what I think our readers like is for us to really sort of dig into these people's finances. They want to know specifically how much pension do they get a year, and how much further does that go in Bulgaria than it does in the UK. I think just like a rundown of, how much it costs to run their car, what they paid for their property, how much does a meal out cost. Like our readers are so interested in just real the specifics of how can I save money by living here instead of living here, or doing this instead of doing that. I think that sort of does really well. I think to echo sort of Carol and Beatrice, like, it's obviously, when we have a case study, it's obviously preferable to have sort of name and photo and everything. If their story is strong enough, and if there's a sort of good reason for them to be anonymous, we can do it. I'm thinking of an example we had last week, not a property story, but it was a story about someone who'd lost a lot of money in their divorce, and we kind of didn't have their ex-wife's side of the story, so we ran it anonymously, and that still did really well, I think, because it was kind of a juicy story and a juicy angle, and people would kind of read it anyway without having a picture of this man and, you know, his full name and details. I think if it is a juicy enough story, we can, but I think in general we would want to have them named and pictured.
Very good. Well, look, again, while you're there, Helen, we had a question in advance from Jess Lariche at Camargue, I think new to the property PR world, was looking forward to the webinar. Thanks, Jess. And said, is there any interest in development stories? And I know we've heard this morning that on the whole, editors don't want development stories from the brand out. What kinds of development stories might work for the Mail's readers, Helen?
I do think we do really struggle to cover development stories. Our audience is sort of so broad looking across the country that it's difficult to find a development story that would sort of grab enough of our readers' interest. We try quite hard to not be London centric as well. You know, a lot of our readers don't live in sort of big cities, so it's something we're quite conscious of. You know, I think covering a new big development in London would probably be something that would be sort of a bad look for us. I think maybe the way we could possibly do it is if we could hang it on maybe finding someone who'd moved to that development. I'm thinking of a story we're working on at the minute, which is on a new retirement living development, and we've got a case study of someone who downsized from her big sort of property in the suburbs somewhere nice to this retirement village, and why she loves it and what it's like to live there. I think if you can get a personal angle into it, it might work for us. The other way we could possibly do it, I suppose, is if there was a really strong story about the local area. We don't tend to focus very often on specific sort of towns or regions, but if there's a really strong reason to do so, maybe we could cover a development within that. I'm thinking of, we did a feature on Skipton in Yorkshire recently, because I think there was some research that said it was the happiest place in the UK. And I think if there's a really strong angle like that, and we can send someone there to go and see that place and talk to people about why they like it, then maybe that's a way that we could get a mention of a development in. But I think in terms of really plugging a specific development, it's just something that we can't really do.
Yeah. I think we're there, Carol, unless you wanted to add anything more to what you said on developments earlier, but I think the time position is clear. Okay, so here's a nice one. The Country Life magazine, close to my heart, predicting the return of the doer upper. So Savills has warned that development viability for new builds will remain challenging this year, leading to supply shortages. Country Life responds by predicting a renewed zest for the doer uppers and renovation projects. My question to the panel, is this a sign of genuine market bravery, or just a collective amnesia about how stressful and expensive it is to actually find a builder who shows up on time? Let's start with Carol. Carol, are we going to see the doer uppers?
I think it's the
latter.
I absolutely think it's the latter of your. I think it's harder to get any tradesmen at the moment. A lot of them, unfortunately, not unfortunately, good for them. They've gone back to Poland or Romania or wherever, because their countries are doing very well economically, and small businesses have been hit by NI. It's harder to find people to do things up. It's expensive. There will be, I think someone said earlier, I can't remember, I'm sorry, whether it was Beatrice or Helen, talking about people staying and improving. I think there will be some of that rather than moving, but I think on the whole, there's a lot of doer-uppers sitting on the market where you could potentially get a good price if you can find a reliable builder who can do it at a good budget. But I think that's where people are struggling.
And
I'm
would you
going
be
to jump in and say that I completely agree with Carol. I think I think the doer-uppers are the ones sitting on the market that nobody wants to buy because everyone knows how expensive it is to do them up. Definitely kind of the middle of the market. And maybe this is the year where people see that opportunity. I don't know. Like maybe those are the stories I'm kind of interested in. But I agree with Carol. Like anyone who's done the maths and doing up properties from scratch that really need the love is like it's not fun.
Interesting. Helen, any thoughts on doer-uppers?
I agree with what's been said in general. The one thing I was trying to pull together a story on, but it didn't quite get out the door, was first-time buyers buying properties from landlords that had been really unloved. I think there might be quite a big market in that, with sort of landlords selling up, and I think maybe an opportunity to buy, not a house that's falling apart, but something that's very unloved and, making it your forever home, to use the horrible phrase. So if anyone's got any case studies on that, that would be great. But I think in general, yeah, doer-uppers are not a good time for it.
Fantastic. So, Helen, again, while you're there, just a question on the new normal for mortgage rates. I think the consensus amongst lenders like Halifax and Nationwide is the reason mortgage affordability is improving is largely because wages are rising rather than any plummeting mortgage rates. Do you see 3.75 to 4.5% as the new normal, or do you think there will be further rate cuts? And is there a risk of demand from first-time buyers collapsing if rates don't fall further and they remain in that bracket?
I'm going to give quite a boring answer, but I think the mortgage market is kind of quite boring at the moment. I think things are falling very at a sort of glacial pace as interest rates go down. I think maybe by the end of this year we'll get to 3.25, 3.5 maybe. I don't think. I mean, if we're lucky, I think we could see sort of around 3% by the end of the year, depending on how interest rates go. I don't think we're going to get back to the sort of 1% level for quite some time, years, possibly ever. I think people are used to it. I think it is tricky for those people who are coming off a 1% and going on to a 4%, obviously. But I think once you kind of got over that barrier, I think people are just going to have to accept that this is sort of how mortgage rates are for now. I think people were worried by the mini budget and that sort of huge spike. I think a lot of people are just glad that rates aren't at sort of 6.5% anymore. I think it's going to be very sort of steady as she goes. 3%, 4% is the norm for the future. The point about first-time buyers, I think some of them have had to sort of temper their expectations. People who are maybe saving a deposit and saw those mortgage rates a few years ago that were super low have maybe had to buy a smaller place or buy somewhere different. And I think maybe that's part of this story. More affordable areas are doing better, and I think perhaps that's part of the reason why people have had to lower their expectations a bit to make sure their mortgage payments are affordable, and that's what's kind of led to these cheaper areas doing quite well.
And again, while you're there, Ethan Henson of Unsworth Sugden says, will the drop in interest rates that we have seen in the last year help shared ownership to thrive still?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I do think that, shared ownership there's always going to be a market for it. I think there's always going to be people who just are never going to save, especially single people who are just never going to be able to save up a big enough deposit on their own. People living in south of England who are on their own, there's always going to be people who need to use shared ownership because they simply cannot get a deposit together. They don't have help from their family. I do think maybe if rates continue to go down, more people might start to think, could I just save up for a little bit longer and manage to buy maybe a small place or a cheap place without using shared ownership. I think people are worried about things now like leaseholds, and I think that's kind of, shared ownership is obviously often blocks of flats, cladding, and I think maybe shared ownership could suffer a bit from that. But I do think fundamentally there's always going to be a sort of small part of the market who, it works for.
Great. one for, I think, Carol, Carly Rogers, head of digital at Lighthouse Communications, says, really enjoying the webinar so far. Phew, that's great news. Currently working on Northern Ireland's first ever BTR, build to rent scheme. So just interested in speakers' opinions on what role they see BTR has in addressing the UK's broader housing shortage and its importance in placemaking. Is that narrative shifting in 2026? What types of BTR content might be of interest outside of that brand and development push? Carly acknowledges that point. Any thoughts on that one, Carol?
Yeah, I think the problem we've had with build to rent is that because it's been concentrated until now in London, the numbers have meant that it's expensive and it's outside the mainstream market. It is appealing on the whole to very well off young professionals or international students. So the market is quite slim. And in terms of our readership, it's quite slim. You know, it's interesting, but it's not broad. It's not challenging the private rented market on the whole yet. So I'd be very interested if there are more affordable options and more mainstream options to build to rent, for sure. I think one of the things that's going to be interesting in the next year is we're seeing a lot more activity in places like Manchester, Liverpool, Leeds, and so on, is whether we hit the affordability ceiling there. And certainly as a proportion of how much you save compared to the South, it's rapidly catching up. And of course, the affordability is pegged to local salaries, not national salaries. So it'd be very interesting, given that properties are now getting more expensive in those locations, what exactly is going to happen over the next year.
Great. Thanks for that, Carol. Okay, so I'll wrap up with a question for our wonderful team on if the property market's going to be rather predictable and dull this year, what are property journalists going to get up to? So, as journalists, you thrive on booms, busts, and crashes. Go on, you know you do really. But almost every prediction for 2026 has used the words like steady, healing, settled, and finding balance. And Helen herself has said it's a steady as she goes year. So if 2026 is going to be the most boring year for property in a decade, what on earth do you want to write about this year? And I know you won't have any trouble with this. Beatrice, why don't you get us started?
I'm going to reply by saying we're kind of saying something we've all mentioned before, which is it's the personal stories. I mean, they're the ones that people love. Yes, there can be kind of major kind of news, news stories that as you say, kind of boom or bust. But actually, we've all said it. The personal stories about why people are moving, advice for them, advice for kind of individuals in the market. Like, it's just, why are people doing things and how are they doing it? That's what people love, because there'll be, many people whose stories dovetail with that. So, yeah.
Thanks for that. Carol, how are you going to keep yourself and your readers happy this year?
Property is never boring, never. The price rises might be stabilizing, which is a good thing, but there's plenty other things going on. And like Beatrice said, individual stories, personal stories, there will be plenty to write about, I'm sure. I am not worried on this score at all.
Good. Well, I'm sure our audience will aim to keep you busy. And Helen, would you sign off with a few thoughts on how to make this year an extra interesting year?
Yeah, I'm going to say personal stories as well, but with the specific, as niche as you like. So I think the one thing we found this year is that our readers' appetite for just such niche stories about what people are doing with their property, with their money, is just endless. Someone who's got a question about a really obscure property tax rule, or and someone who's done a really specific thing to bring their energy bills down in their house. Someone who's got a really weird gripe with their neighbor, just so niche and specific. Like, our readers just love it. So a really knotty personal story, I think, is how we're going to sort of keep our readers interested this year.
Fantastic. All right, pitch in, everyone. Well, it's been an utterly absorbing and illuminating hour. I did promise our panelists we would finish at 1 o'clock on the dot. So we haven't even had a rant about AI particularly, or covered off the north-south divide, but it's been a wonderful hour. Thank you so much to Helen Crane from This Is Money. Thank you to Beatrice Hodgkin from the FT. Thank you to Carol Lewis from the Times. We really appreciate you joining us today. And thank you to all our audience, and look forward to seeing you all next time. Thanks very much indeed.
Thanks so much.
Thanks.
Bye.